Welcome, everybody. We're here to discuss the Willamette Valley and some of our favorite icons today. You might have a couple of wines that you got from Ledoux's. We'll talk about those in a few moments. Some of you might be drinking other Willamette Valley wines that you picked up at your local wine shop or that you have in your cellar already. Rick, I think you said that you were drinking Lingua Franca. Excellent. We'll definitely talk about Larry Stone and Dominique Lafon. Oops, I see another bottle. Is that Bergstrom? I can't quite. Oh, it's Christum. It's Christum. It was hard to see. Yeah. So we have somebody drinking Christum. Absolutely wonderful, like great property. As I was kind of going through the slides that we've used for previous Willamette Valley classes, I really didn't need to update them too much because I realized, although we're highlighting some of the producers in more in-depth slides, that a lot of this class really becomes, what we like to call at Cork Buzz, education through conversation. I always like to touch on the philosophy of a region, and I think we'll go through that as we discuss the Willamette Valley. But just before I start to share my slide, the Willamette Valley is a place where it's not like Napa Valley, and this is not in no way meant to be derogatory toward places like the Napa Valley, but in Napa you have a lot of people who had money who invested in property in Napa Valley, and they have wonderful winemakers who make great wines. There's also small family stories, but the Willamette Valley was really brought up by farmers who had a passion for growing grape varieties on the fringe of a climate that they had seen in other places like California. And their stories are, I think, really what make the Willamette Valley so special and so unique, as well as how they've decided to plant their grapes and farm their wines. So it's going to be a really, I think, kind of an intimate conversation about the Valley today. Let's make sure I'm bringing up the right one here. Perfect. Go back to the beginning. Always a fun time getting set up for Zoom classes. So we'll really talk about the icons as we delve into in-depth the Willamette Valley. This is a photo looking east over the valley from the western side from the Brooks Estate property in the Eola Amity Hills. On a clear day, you can see 4 different volcanic peaks. You can see the Mount Hood, which would typically be directly in front of you. You can see the Sisters a little bit further to the south, and you can see Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier a little bit further to the north. So we'll discuss as we go along just the incredible beauty of the valley itself, because it is just a stunning area to grow grapes and make wine in. 2 wines that we've selected tonight for you to drink from our friends at Ledoux's in the West Village. These are both, I think, really special wines, especially the first one. So we'll talk more in depth about the Irie Vineyard as we come to the Dundee Hills and we start talking about David, Diana, and their son, Jason Lett. But this is a really unique opportunity to taste a grape variety that's not traditionally known in the Willamette Valley. In fact, it wasn't planted there until 2012. Jason Lett planted the first Trousseau. He was really inspired by the wine coming from Eastern France, from a region called the Jura. And he really makes this sort of side project under the Irie name of, I guess we would say, a little bit more of esoteric grape varieties for the Willamette Valley. These grapes are estate. They come from the Sisters Vineyard that's located on one of their Dundee Hill properties. It aged for about 6 months in neutral oak, and it has just a really beautiful perspective of a French grape. I mean, mostly what the grapes that we have planted here are French, but a really beautiful perspective of this grape variety planted in a different climate than we normally see it, which is in Eastern France and in the Jura. So it has these really gorgeous kind of rustic red fruit flavor that's floral. It has a lot of kind of stemmy herbs to it and a beautiful spice. The other wine is a more classic example. It's the Bergstrom Cumberland Reserve. The Cumberland Reserve is sort of almost like an homage or a love letter to the Willamette Valley. So although Bergstrom also tend to focus on a lot of single site, single varietal Pinot Noirs, this one is a collection of some of their favorite barrels from their 5 biodynamically farmed estate vineyards. It does have a little bit of a riper profile, especially to 2020, more candied fruit and violet candy, but it has a really beautiful, almost like tarragon soda and kind of stemmy woodsy herbs character to the wine as well. We're going to talk about both of these producers as we move on a little bit. What should we discuss first, right? But of course, a little bit of Oregon history. Why is the Valley what it is? Oregon has, in terms of its wine history, a pretty recent modern history in terms of its wine growing, the grapes that are planted there. Richard Sommer come to Umpqua Valley from California, and he plants the first vines in Oregon post-Prohibition. To Umpqua Valley from California. These are the first Prohibition vines that are planted in Oregon. There have been a lot of vines that were planted pre-Prohibition. You can kind of think of Oregon as almost like, in a way, kind of a last frontier, right? So there was a time where people were moving west across the Oregon Trail. No mistake that it's called that, because the Oregon Trail really led to this area, the Willamette Valley. The last obstacle in reaching the Pacific Ocean and the coast would be the coastal range, which is one of the ranges that flanks the valley and really protects it from a lot of that cooler ocean air. But the coastal range is much lower than the Cascade Range, which flanks the eastern side of the valley and cuts it off from the more dry, arid interior of the Oregon state. In 1965, David Lett plants the first Pinot Noir, along with other cuttings from UC Davis in the Dundee Hills area of the Willamette Valley. These are kind of a hillside above the town of Dundee. At the time, it wasn't known as the Dundee Hills AVA, but eventually it would be known as so. In the 60s to the early 70s, we see an influx of important names. Charles Corey, David Adelsheim, Dick Ponzi, Dick Erath. We like to say, because we've heard ourselves, that they say at the beginning of Oregon wine, there were 2 Dicks and 2 Davids, Dick Ponzi, Dick Erath, David Adelsheim, and David Lett, of course. Charles Corey has been left out of the history books. He was one of the first, along with David Lett, but Charles Corey and David Lett had kind of a divergent idea of viticulture within the valley. Charles Corey was more industrially minded towards more commercial viticulture and winemaking, and David Lett definitely had a much more artisanal approach to the concept of growing grapes and making wine, and that's still prevalent for the Irie winery today. These 5 growers become the core of the Willamette Valley pioneers. Many of the others that we will talk about came along in the mid-70s or the late 1970s. And then we'll talk about some more of the some of the really kind of younger up and coming. We have about just over 600 wineries within the Willamette Valley. So it really has grown, as you can see. And just, I mean, when you think about that concept, 50 years for 600 wineries. I mean, in places like Burgundy, we have 2 millennia of grape growing and winemaking to develop these wineries. So it's really an area that had developed quite quickly. And part of that is the camaraderie that you do see within this valley. I want to say small valley. It is, of course, but it's not maybe as small as we think it is. But there's sort of a core of the valley. There's somewhat of a heartland where the majority of the nested AVAs are clustered. We have had 4 AVAs join just since 2020. So when I lived in the Willamette Valley for 6 or 8 weeks in 2017. There were 6 nested AVAs. One of the reasons I wanted to go and work harvest in Oregon in the Willamette Valley was so that I would be able to remember them for future wine exams. And now what do? I have to go back because I have to remember the other 5 that have been upgraded since 2019, right? In 1970, Myron Redford plants his first vineyard on the Eola Hills Road and launches Amity Cellars. Amity Cellars has since been sold. I think they sold in like the early 2000 teens, but a very historic vineyard on the Eola Hills Road. It's a kind of a big sloping hill that was primarily planted to nut and fruit trees prior to Myron moving into the area. And we have on this hillside slope a cluster of really important icons that make wine here. Now, as we move forward a little bit, there's not a lot happening in the Willamette Valley yet at this time. There's not a lot of prestige here. These are farmers. It is kind of a similar thing to what we see happening in the Napa Valley at this time, especially like the late 50s, like early 1960s in Napa, where we have this sort of almost in a way like a hippie movement of a lot of people that are looking to move to a more agrarian lifestyle, right? They want to kind of be closer with the land. They're going back to farming. David Lett was one of these, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But we had these kind of small producers that were building homes on the property that they lived on. When you go to the Willamette Valley, you'll oftentimes find that a lot of these pioneers of Oregon viticulture still live in the homes that they built on the vineyards and the properties that they purchased in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s. Now, as we kind of like fast forward, when did we start seeing some interest in Oregon wine? So we almost have sort of like in a way, an Oregon judgment of Paris, just like what we had in Napa Valley. And in the early 1980s, there was a woman, and her name was Becky Wasserman. Becky Wasserman is most well known as an importer of very fine Burgundian wines. Becky lived in Burgundy for decades. She passed away pretty recently, I want to say in 2021, so maybe somewhere around a year ago. But she was, at this time, she was driving around up and down the West Coast with her 2 young sons, Peter and Paul, and she was a barrel salesman. So she essentially worked for a cooper, and she was going up and down the West Coast selling barrels to winemakers. So she was stopping in this kind of new and upcoming region known as the Willamette Valley. She knew and met David Lett here, and David Lett gave her a couple bottles of his wine. So it was actually Becky who, David Lett never submitted these wines, these South Block wines that won this competition in the 1980s, to this competition in Beaune in France. It was Becky Wasserman who had these bottles of wine. She ended up taking those bottles of wine back to Burgundy with her. And there was a tasting being organized primarily by the Druhan family. It was kind of an idea of almost like a Burgundian judgment of Paris. And David Lett's wines won 2nd and 3rd place at this tasting among the top Burgundy reds in Paris and Beaune. This tasting didn't make quite as big of a splash as the Judgment of Paris, but it was really one of the things that helped put the wines and the Pinot Noirs of the Willamette Valley and Oregon on the map. This was also what caused Robert Druhan to say that he would establish Domaine Druhan Oregon, and that his family would make wine in 2 places, in Burgundy and in the United States, in Oregon's Willamette Valley as well. Today, the Domaine Druhan Oregon is still a family-run winery. Veronique Druhan had been the winemaker for, I don't know how long, but I want to say 20 years, if not more. So let's talk about how viticulture is possible in the Willamette Valley. I want to talk maybe later on, but maybe I'll send out some notes because I'm going to keep you guys on time. I'm going to keep me on time today. But if you're interested in the geology and farming practices of the Willamette Valley. Mimi Castile, we're going to talk about the Castile family of Bethel Heights, has an amazing podcast on regenerative farming that I'll probably point out to you with the follow-up later on. So the Willamette Valley. So what is the geology? What is the climate? What is the terroir, right? Climatically, the valley is similar to Burgundy. We have primarily Burgundian grapes planted here. The growing season is actually cooler. So it's overall a cooler season than we see in Burgundy or the Côte d'Or, but it is less compressed. So usually bud break is, you know, I mean, give or take, depending on the vintage, bud break will be a week earlier than the Côte d'Or, and harvest will be a week or maybe more later than the Côte d'Or. So you have a longer growing season of which to develop flavor and structure in the grape varieties. Now we think of the kind of coastal region of the United States, especially Washington, Oregon, as being quite wet and rainy. This is true if you're not blocked by a mountain range. So Willamette Valley is blocked from the coast by the coastal range. And although it is a low, older chain of mountain ranges, most of the rainfall and the precipitation does fall within the winter in the Willamette Valley. So the growing season is pretty dry. So they get very lucky this way. And also because of this, we have a lot of producers who are farming with biodynamic and organic practices within the valley also. More of the trouble would be something like the harvest season, where you might start seeing the impending rains of winter approaching, but you might not have ripeness yet. 2011, vintage does matter. Just like Burgundy, vintage is important in the Willamette Valley. I don't think I have a vintage chart, but we should probably, now I'm just thinking now, right? Sometimes I come up with ideas in class. I'm like, gosh, we should have a vintage chart for the Willamette Valley for you. So a season like, for example, 2011, bud break was very late. It was after the 4th of July. That is, maybe I'm remembering that wrong, but it was unreasonably late. And we had a very, very late harvest because of that. And these wines tend to be like really lean. We had to get the grapes in before, because we had a late harvest before the rains came for the winter season. And so these wines tend to be somewhat austere, especially in their youth, very, very mineral driven, high acid, more earthy, but the complexity that they've developed over the past 10, 11 years is really astounding. So the 2011, although not considered to be a great vintage, and probably because of my preference for styles of wine, had for me turned out to be one of my favorite vintages that do come from the valley. We have varied soils from alluvial floodplain, volcanic soils, lusts, which are windblown, alluvial, water carried by water, uplifted marine sediments from when we had a shallow seabed or ocean floor here. We have the mountain ranges that factor into the climate. The broad valley shaped almost like a V. So up at the top toward Portland, we have the top of the V coming down to a peak near Eugene, the capital of, Salem, the capital, down near Eugene. And most of the vineyards are established around the edges of the boundaries of the Missoula flood deposit. And the vineyards are off the valley floor. The Willamette Valley is an intensely agricultural region, but that's not where we really want to grow grapes. So if you go to the Willamette, you'll notice that they have just a wealth of other crops within the valley. And depending on where the actual geographical area is on top of which soil, you'll really begin to see these different styles of crops. So you definitely see more things like things that you want to grow fast. Things like Christmas trees. The Willamette Valley is one of the biggest suppliers of Christmas trees in the US. They want to grow these trees fast, right? So you put them on a very fertile valley floor with access to a lot of water, a lot of vegetable crops. They sell a lot of trees from the Willamette Valley too, just like landscaping trees. They grow them in the Willamette Valley, and then they ship them as they've already been started to nurseries to be sold to homes, landscapers, so forth. But we really want to keep the grapevine, and this is also true for crops like fruit trees and nut trees, would tend to do well in the same types of soils as grapevines, on the hillsides and up out of the Missoula floodplain deposits and the more humus-rich valley floor. So what grape varieties do we have here? Well, Pinot Noir. Everybody knows this. I definitely have had people ask me, or be surprised, I should say, when we realize that people don't only grow Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley, but it's nearly 60% of all planted vines. We really are starting to see an increase in other grape varieties, and I think a decrease in Pinot Noir, but Pinot Noir is our cash crop. Even when producers might have their hearts in different grapes for overall production, Pinot Noir is still usually what makes the money. So we'll talk about Brooks in a little bit, and Brooks, their heart is Riesling, but Pinot Noir is their income, right? It's their livelihood. Now, the Willamette Valley is one of the most interesting places, aside from Burgundy, to study the concept of terroir on a single grape variety, because the soil and the proximity to the Van Duzer corridor do affect the finished flavor and structure of the wine. And this soil type and this proximity to the corridor, this kind of wind zone or hallway that we have, it's really why we have established the different nested AVAs that we'll discuss. Pinot Gris came here in 1966. Just like Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris was brought here with David Lett. So most of us probably know that Pinot Gris is the same grape variety as Pinot Grigio. Just really where it's grown is how the name changes. Styles here, just like in Alsace, or just like Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, the styles here can range from rich, full, spicy, crisp, or fresh. They can have varying degrees of sweetness and sugar to them. Riesling was widely planted in the 1970s. You can also see kind of a large kaleidoscope of different styles of Riesling coming from the valley. Chardonnay, I think, is one of the most exciting grape varieties in the Willamette right now. Chardonnay was planted by David Lett alongside Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, but he planted the Wente clone coming from California. And so it's interesting that for so long we made so little Chardonnay in the Willamette Valley, when we are discussing how the climatic difference, the climatic similarities to Burgundy. You know, we have, what do we have in Burgundy? We have Pinot Noir and we have Chardonnay, right? Those are the two grapes. So it's interesting that we didn't grow more Chardonnay, but I think that was more because the Wente clone was not necessarily the best suited to the Willamette Valley, but also because we were trying to make more Californian styles with kind of riper, more tropical fruit and more oak, when these styles should be more subdued coming from the Willamette Valley. They do better at more reserved styles that recall the wine of Burgundy, more so than California. Pinot Blanc is increasing in importance. The original vines thought to be Pinot Blanc were planted by David Lett. We're actually Melon de Bourgogne at the Ivory Vineyards. Jason Lett makes a Melon de Bourgogne today. There's some other wineries like Bow and Arrow that are making that as well. And then you're really starting to see an increase in Syrah in the Willamette Valley, more cool climate styles of Syrah coming from Christum is making one, May Syrah. Some other producers, we're starting to see the other Burgundian red, Gamay, another wine that we're seeing planted coming from places like Brickhouse in Ribbon Ridge, AVA, and even more grape varieties, things like Gruner Veltliner, more Alsatian white style blend that are blends of Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Muscat, Gewürztraminer, and so forth. So these are the most planted grape varieties, the most made wines, but certainly just like with any other New World wine region, it's really the geographical boundaries that the appellation stipulates, and not necessarily the grape that has to be used to make the wine. So you will see on bottles of wine, of course, the name of the grape or grapes that are used to make them. You might see more of like a fantasy name, like white blend or something like that. Kind of indicates usually it's probably an Alsatian style blend, Riesling, Gewürztraminer, Muscat, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, etc. We won't spend too much time on clones because we need to get into the individual AVAs and the wine makers, the icons, right? We're here for the icon. But I think it helped to understand clonal selection. So, you know, I would like to say it's so great that New World producers give you so much information on a label of wine. But if we don't know what that means, then it doesn't do anything for us. So it's like, you know, sometimes I joke about the producers that are like, oh, this clone of these grapes, and it says this on the back label, right? Like this clone of these grapes was this old, the vines are this old, and they were harvested at this amount of bricks on this date, and then they were aged in, you know, 77% toast with 1/3 new American oak. And you're just like, that's all really informational, but if we don't understand how any of that affects the finished wine that's coming in that bottle, then that information is useless to us, right? So why might you see clones on labels in the Willamette Valley? And you will. It's just to tell you a little bit about the style of wine perhaps that somebody is trying to make. Most wines in the Willamette Valley are blends of different clone selection. So let's just talk briefly about that, what that means. I'll send you a follow-up with all of this information, so we don't need to go too in-depth about all of it at the moment. But the Oxford Companion to Wine states that a clone is a single vine or population of vines that are derived by vegetative propagation from a single bud or cutting of a single mother vine. So all clones can be traced back to a single bud on one vine. Now, clones do provide diversity in vineyards, but they also allow producers to plant to terroir specificity. Now, something like this would not have been available to do in places like Burgundy 2,000 years ago, right? We didn't understand, we didn't have the concept of understanding grape genetics and understanding what set these different, we understood what set these different clones or vines apart based on the ampelography, actually. So the biggest way that we could really tell vines apart before understanding plant genetics was actually looking at the leaves, right? So how the leaves differed from each other. And then of course, how the flavor of the wine or how the grape bunches or berries looked on the vine were different from one another, right? So we would plant to the specificity of how the grapes looked or the style that we wanted based on how the grape tasted or the finished wine tasted. But now we do it, now we do it with science. In the old world, it's actually common. We do see this sort of like clonal selection for planting, but it's still common to do what we call massal selection in the old world, which is where rather than taking clone selection, you choose some of a handful, any number of your favorite vines in a vineyard. Usually these are older vines that are very established, and you take budwood from them or graft from them based on their superiority for the style of wine that you're trying to make. And then you propagate those into a new vineyard. Let me know if that doesn't make sense. So the New World is much more focused on clonal selection than the Old World. It's also very common in Oregon that you see blocks that are planted specifically to single clones. And oftentimes in the Willamette Valley, these vineyards, these blocks of clones will be harvested separately from other blocks. So because you do choose different clones to plant in a larger single vineyard, because you do have diversity, right? Some might ripen earlier, some might bud later, some might bud earlier, some might ripen later. This helps a lot with impending weather. You have part of your buds in. It also provides diversity of flavor, structure, texture, and complexity to the wine. We make a couple of different wines with Brooks Wine. Cork Bud makes 2 different wines with Brooks in the Willamette Valley, and they always send us samples, or we go out there, send us samples of different bottled vineyard clone, and we actually sit like a mad scientist and we taste them separately. We decide which are our favorites, which we think are better in higher proportion to the wine, and we blend these together, because it's almost like they say, and this is true also for like places like Bordeaux, where we have blends of different red grape varieties, or the Rhone Valley, for example, but that each clone on its own is like a single instrument, and is much better together with the entire orchestra. right? So you'll see some of these terms sometimes: Dijon, Wente, Martini, Mendoza, Mount Eden selection. These are all examples of Pinot Noir, excuse me, of Chardonnay clones. When it comes to Pinot Noir, Dijon clones, the source is Domaine Ponceau, coming from Burgundy. These are very widely celebrated clones. The clone numbers beginning with the double ones are the oldest clones: 114, 115. 667 has a really deep and vibrant color, a lot of tannin. You would use that one for structure in your blend. And 777 is known as the tour de force, flavor and color concentration. When you go to the Willamette Valley to visit and you see these numbers on maybe a tasting sheet or a bottle of wine, or written on a barrel in a cellar if you're doing a barrel tasting, the winemakers will probably be impressed if you say 777, because nobody in Willamette Valley calls it 777, 770, 77, whatever you know, however you would say it, they all call it 777. Roederer clones, Pommard clones are probably the second most important. You see primarily Dijon, Pommard, and Wadenswil. But essentially they all add a different palette in terms of the structure, the acidity, the texture, or the characteristic of the fruit to the finished blend of the wine. All right, now we're in the Willamette Valley. So established in 1984, the soils are a melange, a hodgepodge. We have so many different soil types here. As we mentioned before, you can now see a map of these nested AVAs. So most of them are clustered here together, sort of in the northern part of the valley. It starts up here at Portland, and the valley, this sort of darker shaded area, goes all the way down here below Eugene. So it really is quite a large valley. If you're not within one of these smaller nested AVAs like Long Tom, Van Duzer Corridor, Laurelwood District, etc., you can label your wine simply as Napa Valley. If you want to blend grapes from Lower Long Tom and the Tualatin Hills, as well as somewhere outside of one of the nested AVAs, you can do that, and you can label your wine as Willamette Valley. But if all of your grapes come from one of these single 11 nested AVAs, you are eligible to use that single AVA on your label. So what does that do? It does give us a more singular imprint of terroir based on what we know about these different AVAs, right? So this is most of what Oregon makes. It's more than 80% of Oregon's annual harvest comes just from the Willamette Valley itself. Historically, it is important in terms of modern agriculture and viticulture. It's incredibly important. I mentioned fruit trees, right? I mentioned nut trees, walnuts, hazelnuts. On the West Coast, we call them filberts. I may not have divulged my own personal history, but I'm from Washington State. My grandfather is from Central Oregon, and I did spend 6 weeks working in the Willamette Valley for Brooks as well, which we'll discuss in a little bit. The Van Duzer Corridor is this gap in the coastal range that lets in cool air coming from the Pacific. So as I mentioned before, these 11 nested AVAs in American viticultural areas within the Willamette Valley, their proximity to the Van Duzer Corridor really dramatically affects these individual AVAs and the wines that come from them. Laurelwood District and Tualatin, sorry, this is spelled wrong, Hills were approved in 2020, and they share this really characteristic Laurelwood lush soil that are just outside of Portland. So let's get into a little bit of the soils. I couldn't find a newer map with the newer AVAs, but essentially this is the Tualatin Hills is going to be located over here on the sort of northwest corner, and then the Laurelwood District is located, so this would be the Tualatin Hills over here, and then the Laurelwood District would be on this northern side of the Chehalem Mountains. So you can see that the Laurelwood District had these sort of windblown lush soils that are known as the Laurelwood soils in this area. So we have windblown, sorry, I think it's the lighter, my mistake, the kind of lighter brown color. The beige you see here, Ribbon Ridge, Yamhill Carlton, these are uplifted marine sediment soils. So you can see these on the western side of the Eola Amity Hills, McMinnville, Dundee Hills, the southern side of Chehalem Mountain. So essentially this would be north. Portland is like somewhere right up over here if you're looking at this map. The McMinnville, Dundee Hills, the southern side of Chehalem Mountains, the eastern side of the Eola Amity Hill. These are basalt soils. So these are like your Nikaya, your Jory series soils. The soil, Jory, is the official soil of Oregon, if you were curious about what it might be. These brown soils are Missoula floodplain soils. We don't have a ton of time to go into the Missoula flood, but Missoula flood were a series of really catastrophic floods that took place over hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe not longer, maybe thousands of years. But these floods happened hundreds of times, and essentially they're why the landscape of Eastern Washington is so alien looking. Just really dry volcanic hills, sagebrush, nothing grows. One, it's a desert in Eastern Washington because there's very little rainfall and precipitation, but also because the force of these floods just stripped the landscape of its vegetation. There's an area that's sort of east of Portland called the Wallula Gap, and these Missoula flood waters essentially would have a bottleneck behind the Wallula Gap on the Washington side and would slowly trickle through and drain out through this gap. So they would drain down into the Willamette Valley in this area. So you have the Missoula floodplain soils. They're very, very deep soils. They are really great for other types of agriculture, but not necessarily for viticulture. And then the blue soils, this is not water, it's actually alluvial soils. Alluvial soils are soils that are moved by water. So you can see that primarily these alluvial soils, kind of like flood, kind of like just on the river bed of the floodplain, are typically moved one direction from water over time. So we can see a map again of these nested AVAs. So starting up the Chehalem Mountains, we have the Laurelwood District, Tualatin Hills. Here we have Yamhill Carlton, Ribbon Ridge, the Dundee Hills, McMinnville. This is the Van Duzer Corridor, one of the newer ones since 2019, I think. The Eola Amity Hills, and then we'll talk about Lower Long Tom as well. Some fun names coming from the Willamette. This just gives us a little bit of a topographical view of what we can expect. So you can see green, verdant, closer to the coast. As you move into Eastern Washington, this is desert. We do have wine growing regions in Oregon outside of, did I say Washington? Sorry, Oregon. We do have wine growing regions outside of the Willamette Valley in Oregon, but very few and far between. So we have several in the south down here, areas like Rogue or Umpqua Valley, Red Hills of Douglas County. We have the Columbia River Gorge area up here. And then we also have the Walla Walla Valley, which extends from Washington into Oregon as well. There's also an AVA that borders and is shared with Idaho too, but you don't really see much of this on labels. So if we get into some of these smaller nested AVAs, the first we'll talk about the Chehalem Mountains, established in 2006. So it's a range of uplifted hills and ridges. We have this deposited Laurelwood soil series on the north slopes. This is the area that was recently lifted as its own AVA, known as the Laurelwood District. This has some of the coolest average temperatures, which help pronounce wines that have a much more defined structure and pronounced acidity to the wines. So who are some producers that we might expect? So this is one thing that you really start to think about. Why do we care about these individual AVAs? Because they do all have their own character. And when we understand the vineyards that are located in these AVAs or the producers who make wine from them, we can more confidently shop for a style that we enjoy, right? Does that mean you need to memorize every single vineyard, every producer, every single style of each AVA? Now there's 11 sub-AVAs of Willamette Valley. That's not what it means. It means understand your own personal palate and then learn about the different AVAs that produce that style. So when you go to a wine shop and you're looking to buy new wine, you'll probably be able to find something that suits your palate better. So producers here would be Beckham, Bergstrom, Rocco, Flanor, Elk Cove, Erath, Ponzi, Adelsheim, Iwas main vineyard, I believe, is located here. This is one of the areas that Adelsheim started in the 1960s. Some of my favorite small producers are Beckham. Andrew and his wife. Andrew is a pottery teacher at a local high school in the Willamette Valley. He not only farms grapes and they make their own wines on their estate vineyard within the Chehalem Mountain, but he also makes qvevri, or we would call them like amphora or clay pots for aging wine. So the Beckham family has sort of two lines that they make wine from, one of which is a more traditional styles of wine, Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, etc., from the Willamette Valley, and the other of which is a amphora aged line. So he makes his own clay pot that they make their wine in. He also makes clay pot to sell to other producers in the US. There's another of our favorite Willamette Valley producers. His name is Joe Swick, a little bit more of a natural producer, and he's branching out to make more wine in places like Washington. But he went to the same high school where Andrew Beckham was a teacher. Bergstrom, this was started by John Bergstrom and his wife in the 1990s. Josh Bergstrom is the first to make wine from the property. So John and his wife really wanted to start a project to pass on to their children. So Josh was really the first to actually take the project and make anything from it and make wine from it, starting in 2001, I think. Rocco is a really important winery started by Roland Souls. Roland Souls is the proprietor. He's the founder of Argyle Wine, which is one of the Willamette Valleys located in the town of Dundee, one of their most important sparkling wine producers. He started Argyle as a very small artisanal sparkling wine facility, and then grew that and sold it so that he could start his other passion project, Rocco, which focuses primarily on Pinot Noir. They're located here. Elk Cove started in the late 70s. We'll talk about them. Erath and Ponzi and Adelsheim, right? These are all some of the biggest names that we've really been discussing throughout the class. So like I said, like education through conversation, right? You're definitely going to start hearing and remembering these names over and over. Ribbon Ridge AVA, it's just a small thumb that kind of extends south from the Chehalem Mountain that rides up and off the valley floor. The smallest sub-AVA in the Willamette Valley. The soils here are incredibly uniform, and because of its small size, it's one of the most densely planted areas in the valley. All of the grapes here are dry farmed. The Pinot Noir coming from this region tend to be a little bit on the more powerful side. It can be very perfumed. It has a lot of spice to it. One of the most well-known producers is Beaufrere. Beaufrere makes a fuller, more voluptuous style of wine. It was started by Mike Etzel and his brother-in-law, a young lawyer and wine writer named Robert Parker. So Robert Parker, I don't believe he's still part of the project, but started Beaufrere with his brother-in-law, Mike Etzel, and his son now is the winemaker, but initially started by Robert Parker. So you can understand that kind of like bigger, bolder, voluptuous style that we're talking about for Beaufrere. So it sort of sits right within that wheelhouse for Robert Parker, right? Brickhouse is located here. They make excellent Gamay. You don't see a ton of Gamay coming from the Willamette Valley. They're definitely one of the benchmarks for that grape variety. Trisatum is really well known, along with Brooks, for the quality of their different single vineyard Riesling and aromatic white blend. Patricia Green, she made beautiful wine. Also, she would name her wines for the different soil series that you would see in the Willamette Valley, so that you could really see the imprint of the soil on the wine. Patricia passed away at the end of the harvest in 2017. It was kind of unexpected in the valley. It was a little bit of a blow, but they are carrying on her legacy, and the wines are still being made as well. So the Dundee Hills. So established in 2004, the official AVA, but this is the site of the original Pinot Noir planting, Pinot Gris plantings in the Willamette Valley. It is very densely planted, the most historic region within the valley. It's the site of David Lett's original Eyrie vineyard. This is the benchmark style of Pinot Noir. It tends to be the most delicate. It's very perfumed. It has long ageability to it. We have uniform red Jory soil. If you have been to the town of Dundee, it's very unassuming. There's a couple of bars. It's literally like, so this is what it looks like. You can see on this road here. So it's just like, oh, sorry, it's this one right here. This is the river. So there's just this road. It's like a 2-lane highway, like 1 or 2 cars in each direction that just drives through the town. It just dotted on either side of this road. That's it. It's just a 1-street town, this town of Dundee. There's nothing there. But then behind it is just this beautiful behemoth hill of some of the most iconic Pinot Noir producers, definitely in the US, but maybe even in the world. So Eyrie is here, Arterbury Marsh is here, the Argyll, the sparkling wine house that was started by Roland Souls of Rocco is here. Bergstrom has vineyards here. Domaine Drouin is here. Erath, Purple Hand. Purple Hand is a younger winery that was started by Corey Wright, who's the son of Ken Wright, who we're going to talk about. Just like Burgundy, nepotism is alive in the Willamette Valley. But why do we consider wine from Burgundy to be so iconic in their own right? A lot of the time it's because you have this lineage of history of a single family passing down their collective knowledge about farming a single piece of land, right? And how you can make the product that you get from that wine from those grapes. And maybe we can do the same thing in the Willamette Valley, because the Willamette Valley really is a bucolic, beautiful, quiet valley. But the people that live here are very cosmopolitan. A lot of them have come from around the world to make wine in this region. You have the city of Portland that's very close. I mean, depending on where you are in Willamette Valley, you know, it's anywhere from a 2-hour to a 30-minute drive. So it's really an interesting place. So the Dundee Hills, we really want to talk about David Lett. I could probably talk about David Lett for the next like 3 hours, so we won't do that. But Matt Kramer had a quote that I thought was really beautiful, so I put it here. David Lett pioneered both Pinot Noir and its white wine cousin, Pinot Gris, the 2 grapes that define Oregon wine today. But just as important, he established the very tone of Oregon wine growing: artisanal, individualistic, and idiosyncratic. If you look at Oregon's 300 plus wineries, this must have been written a long time ago because it's far more than 300 now, but 300 plus wineries and 17,000 plus acres of vines, you can trace all of that back to David Lett. But he left more than that. He bequeathed a uniquely Oregon wine genome, one that now others seek to copy. So this really is, you know, David Lett really was the father of Oregon wine. So I'm gonna make this story really short. David Lett was going to go to dental school. He had an appointment in the 1960s at this dental school in somewhere in California, San Francisco, somewhere like that. He was driving there from his home in Chicago. On his way, he drove through Oregon. He drove through California, and he happened to stop and run into somebody on the side of the road tending a vineyard in California. And this man was Lee Stewart of Souverain Cellars. Souverain Cellars is one of the most important wineries in Napa Valley, especially for the history and the up-and-coming winemakers that we think of as Napa Valley icons today. Producers like Warren Winiarski, Mark Gergich, all worked for Lee Stewart at Souverain Cellars, the 2 producers whose wine won the Judgment of Paris in 1976. So David stopped and started talking to this man, Lee Stewart. He was really interested by what was happening. And he went to California. He went to his interview. When he drove back to Chicago, he had a letter from Lee inviting him to come work for him in California at his winery. David's parents did not want him to do this. Like they wanted their son to not kind of move back into an agrarian lifestyle, especially in the 1960s. You have a lot of advances in technology during this time. They really wanted him to go into one of these fields, but they acquiesced as long as he would actually go to school for winemaking and grape growing. So David went to UC Davis. When he left UC Davis, he knew that he wanted to work with Pinot Noir, and he knew that he wanted to work with it in a climate that wasn't California. So he started looking in Oregon for the perfect place to plant his first vineyard for Pinot Noir. He and his wife, from what I understand, and this could be wrong, maybe it's just hearsay, they'd known each other for about 3 months when they got married. They found their vineyard and planted their vines on their honeymoon. Today, their son Jason is the winemaker for the Ivory Vineyard. It is named for a eagle's nest known as the Eyrie that was planted above the vineyard. So the Ivory Vineyard and a lot of the wineries that we're talking about are biodynamic estates. They're really in tune with the entire ecological environment, the soil health, the insect population, the rodent and animal population, plant populations within their vineyard. So they really are their own environments, which is really something that's interesting. Probably the vineyard would not necessarily always be the kind of glossy cover shoot, right, or cover of a magazine for showing off a winery, because as Mimi Castile of Bethel Heights said, she says, a vineyard that's farmed well looks messy. The vines aren't trimmed all to the same height. There are cover crops growing in between the rows of the vines. They're teeming with life. There should be birds and rabbits and insects, because a vineyard really should create an ecosystem for all of these things to live and to replenish the topsoil within these vineyards as well. Okay, I digress. I'm getting off topic. Yamhill Carlton, this is the warmest. They usually ripen their grapes the earliest. Shea Vineyard is a very important site. These wines are ripe, they're textural, they have a lot of full body to them. Top producers are Anamee, Big Table Farm, Elk Cove, mentioned before, Nicholas J., Ken Wright. Ken Wright is the father of Corey Wright, Purple Hands, and Penner Ash are all very important areas. This is the village or the town of Carlton. There's a lot of great restaurants here outside of McMinnville. There's a lot in McMinnville. We haven't gotten there yet, so we'll discuss that. But a lot of great restaurants in Carlton. There's also kind of like custom crush facilities. So a lot of smaller winemakers that don't have their own facilities yet make wine at one of these custom crush areas. But warm, round, ripe, textural, bigger, bolder styles of wine. Some of the icons, so Elk Cove, they're a bigger winery than in terms of their production than most of the wineries that we're really talking about today. But they did start in the late 1970s, mid-1970s, 1974 by Pat and Joe Campbell. They are still family owned and run. The winemaker today is Adam Campbell. He's a fifth generation Oregon farmer and a second generation winemaker. As I kind of mentioned earlier, and I say this in no way that's meant to be detrimental to places like Napa. If you compare that, why am I comparing the two? They're both iconic. They're both valleys. And that really is the reason, right? Not because one is better or worse than the other, but they really stylistically, they're different. They grow different grape varieties. They make different styles of wine. They have completely different climates. They have completely different incomes in terms of their, what should I say, like economics in terms of the money and the tourism that they bring in, right? But one of the things I kind of mentioned before is, in the Napa Valley, there are a lot of wineries that were established by people who made these investment projects. And that is not a reflection of the quality of the wine or the intentions of the people who did this, because the intentions were in the right place and the quality of the wine is great. But these were not people like the Campbell family who set up a trailer, essentially like a camping trailer on this plot of land that they bought. And they lived there with their children so that they could establish a vineyard, build a winery, and build a home to raise their family there. They ended up calling the property Elk Cove because the first winter that they were there, staying in their camper trailer, a herd of about 40 Roosevelt oak bedded down in the clearing of their new property. So they called it Elk Cove ever since that point. Big Table Farm is a younger producer that kind of one of my favorites. Brian Marcy and Claire Carver, a winemaker and an artist. They grow and produce what they like to eat and what they like to drink. It is a big table farm. It is a full working biodynamic regenerative farm that balances water, soil, animals, and vines. They make excellent Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, along with aromatic white grape varieties, Pinot Gris, etc. They make some orange wine. Nicholas J. The collaboration between Burgundian winemaker John Nicholas Mayo of Mayo Camusé and music entrepreneur Jay Boberg. They're known for the Bishop Creek Vineyard located in Yamhill, Carlton. I think their main winery is in Dundee, but their main estate vineyard is in Yamhill, Carlton. And I don't think we mentioned this earlier, but it is common to see one producer who either owns vineyards or purchases grapes from different vineyards in different AVAs. So, you know, you're not only tied to one or the other. Brooks Wine, for example, buys a lot of different single vineyard grapes and then makes single vineyard wines out of them. Same with Ken Wright, who we're talking about next. Ken Wright, the father of Corey Wright of Purple Hand, he was from Kentucky. He worked in bourbon country. He worked in bourbon. He fell in love with wine and left Kentucky to attend UC Davis. He worked in California for 8 years, but in 1976, he took a trip to the Willamette Valley, and he was convinced that this is where the finest Pinot Noir in America was being grown in the mid-1970s. So about 11 years after Pinot Noir first came to the Valley. He was instrumental in organizing the original 6 nested AVAs of the Willamette Valley. It's bureaucratic. It takes time to have these things approved. He was a large supporter of improvements and renovations in downtown Carlton. They purchased a lot of the older downtown apartments, buildings, so forth, and have renovated them, including the old train station, which is now the Ken Wright tasting room. And he's really known for his single vineyard Pinot Noirs. One thing about wineries like Elk Cove, Ken Wright, not quite Pinot Noir because they weren't founded till the 90s, but you know, Ken Wright, Elk Cove, the Ivory Vineyards. If you are somebody who likes the flavor of aged wine, you can find it in these producers. You're not going to find it from Nicholas J. You're not going to find it from Big Table Farm because these are more modern, younger, less established producers. They just simply didn't make wine dating back to the 60s, 70s, 80s. And some of them not even into the 90s. Big Table Farm started in, I think, 2011. So the oldest wine you would be able to find would maybe be a 2011, 2012. But also when you think about, these are really small wineries that are just establishing themselves. Oftentimes they don't have space to store wine, and oftentimes they need the capital. So sometimes these younger wineries that are establishing themselves never hold back any wine to age because they simply need to sell it so that they can continue to plant their vineyards and tend to them and build their wineries and so forth. So McMinnville is a tangle of soil types, but it sits squarely in the path of the Van Duzer corridor. So it's a recipient of the very constant cool coastal winds. Most of the vineyards are planted on the eastern side so they can be protected from those winds coming from the west. Because of this wind, the skins are thicker. That makes the wines more tannic. They have darker fruit. They have more pigment to them. This is becoming one of the places that's well known for Syrah within the Willamette Valley. May Syrah and Breton are 2 well-known properties within McMinnville. Breton was founded by Robert Breton, who spent 16 years as the winemaker at Stag's Leap Winery. This is Stag's Leap Winery, not Stag's Leap Wine Cellar, which was the one that won the Judgment of Paris, but also a well-established winery within the Stag's Leap AVA. They're really well known for not just their Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, but also for the Syrah that they're making. The Breton wine can be really beautiful. Eola-Amity Hills. This is really an area that's defined by Aeolian winds. So Aeolus was the Greek god of the wind. This AVA is directly east of the Van Duzer corridor. So they're not quite, the winds aren't quite as punishing as McMinnville, but we do see an increase in the of wind in the afternoon. And this has some of the coolest average temperatures of any of the sub-AVAs within the Willamette Valley. Because of this cooler growing climate, the Pinot Noir ripened later here, which means it develops a really kind of beautiful flavor, color, a lot of red fruit, really pronounced acidity because of that diurnal shift that you get. We do have these sort of warmer days, but it cools down much quicker than other areas of the Willamette Valley at night. You can't, what's the term, like throw a penny? Like you can't throw a penny without hitting an iconic producer in the Willamette Hills. We have Brooks, we have Bethel Heights, we have Hopewell with Mimi Castile, Christum, St. Innocent, Walter Scott, Evening Land, Fela, Oregon is here, Lingua Franca, Grochow. We're going to talk about Brooks Wines first. So Brooks Wine was founded in 1998 by Jimmy Brooks, who was a Portland native who loved traveling. That was where his first love was. He traveled the world, ended up in winemaking. He worked harvest in Beaujolais, and he came back and started making wine in the Willamette Valley. He was very focused on biodynamic viticulture from the very beginning, a more natural style of winemaking. He very unexpectedly passed away right at the beginning of the 2004 harvest. So none of the fruit was actually brought in. And his sister Janie, living in California, she was working, I think, in like pharmaceutical sales or healthcare or something like that. And she came back to Oregon, of course, and she ended up meeting with this group of friends and winemakers of Jimmy's who wanted to take the grapes so that the growers could get paid for their grapes and make the wine out of it. But they needed somebody who had a handle on Jimmy kind of like finances and was able to manage his estate to be able to say that they could do this. So Janie took over the managing of the estate. The estate and winery itself was left to his son at the time, who was 8 years old, who was Pascal or Paco. You can see him on the left-hand side here. Chris Williams was his Jimmy's best friend and assistant winemaker in 2004 at the time of his death. And Chris had been the winemaker for Brooks Wines ever since. And what they've done under the management and direction of Jimmy's sister, Janie, it really is something incredible. They're a wonderful biodynamic property. They have a great restaurant. They have a biodynamic garden, not just for grapevines, but also for produce that they use in the restaurant. They have an estate vineyard that's home to some of the oldest Riesling vines in the valley, planted in the 1970s. And they also participate in a yearly internship program. So they provide jobs to young wine professionals, writers, sommeliers, chefs, aspiring winemakers to come and work with them for their harvest. They do pay them. It's not an unpaid internship like you probably heard horror stories about in Europe. It's a paid internship, and I was able to take part of this in 2017. So it's why not only are they an icon to me, but genuinely they're, I think, one of the really, even though they're a younger property, a winery, starting in 1998. They are the benchmark and the stalwart of Riesling in the Willamette Valley. So they make a lot of Pinot Noir, but their heart is really all about the Riesling. So we do 2 blends with them. At Corkbed, we make a Pinot Noir and a Riesling with them under our own label. So you can actually try both of those at either of our Corkbed locations, which is really fun. Bethel Heights is a little bit further south from Brooks, which is located on the Willamette Hill. Started by Ted Castile, Pat Dudley, Terry Castile, Marilyn Webb, and Barbara Dudley in 1977. The family knew that they wanted to raise their children there. So they left it as a flourishing ecosystem. The 5 cousins today, their children are all involved in the property. Initially, the site was a walnut grove, and walnut trees still rim the vineyards. These vines are own rooted. So this means that they're not planted on American rootstock that are phylloxera resistant. So this vineyard has actually been living with phylloxera for more than 20 years. I can't go into, because we're already 5 minutes over, and I don't want to keep you for anything more than another 5 minutes. So we can't go into the history of why these vines are still alive and how well they're doing, but it has to do with this ecosystem and this way of regenerative farming that and establishing vines when they're young through careful farming, through not tilling and breaking up the root system, through dry farming, letting the vines grow deeper into the earth, the vine roots, excuse me, grow deeper and into the earth, that allows these vineyards to actually still live with phylloxera. Will they be able to live forever? They won't. But because these vines are own rooted and because they've been able to live with phylloxera for the last 20 years, these are some of the oldest own rooted Pinot Noir and Chardonnay vines in the entire world. Not in Oregon, in the world. I don't know of a single unrooted vine or own rooted vine in Burgundy. Maybe they exist, but I don't know of them. Okay, moving on. St. Innocent. Mark Vlasák is the founder. He studied with Fred Arterbury, Fred Arterbury Jr. at Arterbury Marsh for 8 years. Arterbury was one of the first sparkling wine producers in the Willamette Valley. Mark was really interested in sparkling wine. That's actually what he wanted to do, although he makes Pinot Noir and Chardonnay at his St. Innocent project. The really famous wine comes from Temperance Vineyard in the Eola Amity Hills. Walter Scott apprenticed with Mark Vlasák for a long time. I think Walter Scott, the name of the winery, the winemaker is Ken Palo. The winery is named for one of his nephews and also his grandfather, so Walter and Scott. These are some of the most thoughtful, stunning Chardonnays in the Willamette Valley. These are soul-stirring wines. The way that he farms and the way that he makes his wine, while it has an homage to a more Burgundian style, especially with how he picks his grapes and farms, he doesn't really do the whole separate blocks of clone picked at separate times. He does more of a Burgundian fashion of just picking everything together. Some will be underripe, some will be overripe, most will be right in the middle, and they balance each other out, right? It's kind of the Burgundian model of that. But he really crafts wines that are of Oregon. These are Chardonnays of Oregon. So they don't taste like California Chardonnay. They don't taste like Burgundy Chardonnay. They're in a class of their own, very small production. His facility is located on Justice Vineyard. They're located just to the north of Bethel Heights, which we just talked about. So he's on the Justice Vineyard, surrounded by the Bethel Heights Estate Vineyard. Lingua Franca, I know Rick is drinking this, so a project founded by Larry Stone, who's a master sommelier, and Dominique Lafon, one of the best white winemakers in the entire world. Lingua Franca does make Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. These are very beautiful site-specific wines coming from the Eola Amity Hills. They have a full-time winemaker that lives on site. His name is Thomas Sauve. He's also Burgundian in origin, is where he comes from in France. But I love the wines of Dominique Lafon. And, I would like to say, why do we learn about wine? So we can find better value and better wine to drink for ourselves. Well, if you want to drink Dominique Lafon's wine coming from his family estate in Meursault in Burgundy, Domaine de Comte Lafon, I mean, you're not going to spend less than $300, like at the very, very least, right? But if you want to see what his style is about, you can drink Lingua Franca. I just realized that there's a typo here. This should say Franca. I apologize. I'll fix that before sending out the slide tomorrow. But Lingua Franca is an opportunity to try a wine that comes from one of the world's best winemakers. It's a pretty cool opportunity to taste those things. Christum, they are big proponents of whole cluster vinification using the stems of the grapes within their winemaking as well. They are also a biodynamic vineyard. I think that Walter Scott is, Lingua Franca is, Christum is, Brooks is, Bethel Heights is. I don't know about St. Innocent, but I think that they're definitely organic at the very least. I didn't purposefully choose producers who are organic and biodynamic, but the truth is you grow better grapes when you make them in a way that is conscientious about the farming, the environment, because it allows the environment to correct itself, and you don't have to keep messing with the wine over and over and over to correct things that are going wrong. So the last couple of AVAs we'll talk about, the Van Duzer corridor. It's much newer, kind of like a speed bump in a way for the Eola Amity Hill. So it was established in 2019. It took like 7 years to establish this AVA. The proposal was in the works forever. It's the Trade and Tax Bureau that covers the governing of the American viticultural areas in the United States. So very bureaucratic. It takes a really long time to establish the boundaries and any laws of the particular AVAs before they come into effect. But essentially took 7 years, but it's kind of like a speed bump. The wind sort of slows down and breaks up some of that wind before it starts to hit the Eola Amity Hill. In the Eola Amity, as I mentioned before, most of the vineyards are planted on the eastern side, so they're protected a little bit from that wind. And as you're moving, like if you're driving up the Eola Amity Hills Road, where like Brooks is, Grochow Cellars is there, Brooks, Grochow, many of there's not a ton of wineries, but there's a lot of vineyards on the road that people buy grapes from in the Willamette Valley. You're going up the hill, and it's not up until above Grochow that you really start to crest the hill and kind of see toward the Pacific Ocean on the other side. So you're not quite in the coastal range, but this is a series of hills here. So this is sort of a speed bump. The wind rushes over it. There's not very many vineyards on the western side of the Eola Amity Hills. There's there is Rose Rock, which is the Druhan Estate vineyard located somewhere at the south. And then there's one over here that I'm trying to remember the name. Brooks sources wine from it, but I can't remember the name at the moment. Laurelwood District, we talked about already. The more uniform, less blown Laurelwood soils. Ponzi Vineyard is one of the most important here, one of the first established. Tualatin Hills AVA, that kind of hard northwest corner of the valley. It just a sort of little slice that's almost like a horseshoe, kind of like the Yamhill Carlton AVA. This was home to the very first commercial vineyard in Oregon, defined by the Tualatin River watershed. We also have a large concentration of the Laurelwood soils here. Montanore is one of the better known estates. Their wines are, I mean, it's like, I never like to be like, I never like to like trash any wineries, and I'm definitely not trying to, but the wines are okay. But they're really kind of one of the only best known wineries that located in this AVA at the time. So hopefully that will improve. And if anybody's a really big fan of Montanore, I'm sorry, and don't tell them that I said that. But I just think that the quality of some other wineries is better. Lower Long Tom, also established in 2021. You see a lot more of the bell pine and volcanic joy soils here. It derived its name from its position on the west side of the Long Tom watershed. The coastal range, as with other areas, acts as a weather shield. The top producer here is called Antiquum Farm. It's a project from Stephen Hagan and Andrew Bandy Smith. It's a family wine farm that really amplifies the voice of the land is what their goal to achieve is here. They've eliminated fertilizer. They have sheep, chickens, geese, pigs that graze within the vineyard. And like some of these other producers we've talked about, they're really starting an entire kind of diverse ecological system within their vineyard. Mount Pigsaw, Polk County, established in 2022. So the producer I really want to talk about here is Illahee Vineyards. So Illahee Vineyards for a long time was one of those first wineries that would just always release their wines as Willamette Valley. So they have two projects at their property. So the first one is Illahee, and the second one is Illahee 1899. For the Illahee 1899 wine, the production is very small. The reason is that they make all of the wines the way that wine would have been made and distributed pre-1899. So before the invention of electricity or modern mechanization. So they do everything by hand. Bottling, I don't know where they get their bottles. I'd be curious to know about that, but like bottling, labels, corking, everything done by hand, everything worked in the vineyard with draft horses. All of the grapes are brought to the winery with horses. There's no mechanization or electricity in the winemaking at all, including getting their wine to the distributor. So they take the finished wine, to a distributor in a horse-drawn cart. They take it to a river and they take that wine by canoe on the river to Portland to the distributor. So I've never had a chance to have one of the Illahee 1899 wines. I've had some of their other wines that are really beautiful, but something to be aware of within the area too. Oh, sorry to keep you over, everybody. I know a couple people had to jump off. I saw that earlier. But yeah, so sorry to like keep you over here. I just wanted to touch on some of these kind of new and exciting things that are happening within the Valley. We have a list of some of the producers here that we just really love that we mentioned. The Irie Vineyard, Walter Scott, Brooks Wines, Illahee, Kelly Fox. We didn't mention those wines. Elk Cove, Bow and Arrow, Brick House, Christum, Teutonic wines are also really beautiful coming from the area. You know, we always like to say a lot of what we really love is to have the knowledge to begin to explore these wine regions ourselves. And when we walk into a wine shop or a restaurant and we're looking at a list or a shelf of an endless, you know, sea of shelves of wine, we hope that we've aimed you with the knowledge to be able to make more informed decisions for yourself. Thank you so much, everybody. I don't want to keep you all night because I've already kept you over. I will send out a follow-up with some information. I also will send some, not only a copy of these slides for you, but also some additional information to be able to look up on your own. Definitely some podcasts to listen to that I think give a really fantastic context to the Valley and to some of these kind of top iconic producers as well. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great night. I'll see you soon.